So I have been at Mississippi all week and doing things that are outside my comfort zone, like, for example, physical labor. It's not really something I did, while I was in Mississippi, particularly before bed, I spent some time in these passages here, reading and thinking and praying. And when I got home, I wrote out some notes for this, which I didn't bother to even print out because I was like, they're just notes. I'll remember them, which I'm now regretting. But I really enjoy this passage and this story, so I hope that comes through. As is my wont, it'll be a little scattered, but I hope it'll be memorable and meaningful to you. So if you recall, because I barely recall, since I've been gone for months apparently, we're in 1 Samuel, and the story unfolds such that Israel is it's under a theocracy. I guess that's the best term to use for it, which is to say that Israel is under the charge, the keep of what we call judges, and that's the English word we use for it, who are these men, and some women, or a woman anyway, Deborah, who essentially act something like kings in Israel. People bring to them their grievances and their matters to be judged, hence the term judges, and the judges decide who's in the right and who's in the wrong as per the Levitical or Deuteronomy laws. And also they have a military role, which is God raises up a judge, and they are to fight for the land and for the people in a time and a place in the ancient Near East that was very bloody and constantly hotly contested lands that people are always fighting over through Israel, Syria, modern-day Iraq, Egypt, and so on and so forth. So that's sort of the rubric, and God set up this system. Obviously, that was the founding of Israel, the 12 tribes, with the judges ruling over them. So that was it was a theocracy, and when the judges were concerned about something, or when they had a fear of something or anxiety, or they would pray. They would take it to the Lord and they would listen. And that's really what made a judge, was this deep relationship between them and God. And in the Old Testament language, it would say how the Spirit would come upon them. But it wasn't just like the taking over of your body, although sometimes it reads like that, but it was also reciprocated that the judges would also turn to God to ask for his direction and his favor, as indeed Samuel does. And in fact, that was Eli was the judge before Samuel. That was Eli's great sin, is he was so passive, he just didn't take things to the Lord. He knew God was real, he believed God, but he didn't go to the Lord with his questions. Sometimes we do that as well. We know God is real, we believe God, we trust God, we come to church, we read his word, but when something hard hits our life, sometimes we play the Eli and we don't go to the Lord because we think we can either solve it ourselves or we think God is busy doing something over there. I mean, honestly, I don't know. Just a human thing that we do. So what happens in essence is that the Israelites reject this theocracy. They say it's too scary, it's too unreliable, and we're just not having it anymore. And this begins what we call the kingship, beginning with King Saul. And the way in which they reject God really is centered around the ark. Now you remember where we left off was that the ark had been captured by the Philistines. They had this big battle. Philistines defeated the Israelites and they captured the ark, and they take it, we're taking your most prized religious possession, and then they find that God is real, and that's kind of a drag for them because they start dying in large numbers. So that's what happens, and it's interesting to find out something about the pagan philosophy and pagan, how they think about things. I'll just read this to you because I find it interesting. When the Ark of the Lord, I'm in chapter 6, by the way. I'm in 1 Samuel chapter 6, if you want to follow along. And I don't have, most of what I'm reading today I don't have up there because I'm doing a lot of reading. I didn't want to be, and I know I'd be jumping around. I didn't want, so you might want to follow along in the Bible. I'm starting in 1 Samuel 6, and I'll tell you where I go from there. When the ark of the Lord had been in Philistine territory 7 months, the Philistines called for the priests and the diviners and said, "What are we going to do with this thing? because everywhere the ark went, these plagues would come down and people would die. God would send a disease. As we talked about before, when holiness comes into a place of sin, death is always the logical conclusion. So the Philistines' priestly class say, and this is in verse 3, if you return the ark of the God of Israel, don't send it back to him without a gift. Now remember, these are pagan polytheists, so they actually believe in God. Okay, it's important to remember that they believe in Yahweh, they believe in the Israelites' God, and now their thing is to appease him. They figure they've ticked him off so bad that they got to do something to appease him. So if you return the ark of the God of Israel, do not send it back to him without a gift. By all means, send a guilt offering to him. In other words, admit that you did something bad by stealing the ark. Then you'll be healed, and you'll know why his hand has not been lifted from you. And the Philistines say, what should we do? And the priests say, 5 gold tumors and 5 gold rats, according to the number of the Philistine rulers. You're laughing because you know what's coming. 5 gold tumors and 5 gold rats, according to the number of the Philistine rulers, because the same plague has struck both you and your rulers. So there's this thing called sympathetic magic. You've probably heard of it. Maybe you haven't. Doesn't matter. There's this thing called sympathetic magic. It was really big in the pagan world, where the thing that was killing you, whatever it was, you'd make a model of it. You'd make it's sort of like kind of voodoo, I guess. And you'd make a model of it, and then you'd send it away, or destroy it, or bury it, or drown it. And the idea was that would kill the thing itself. So that's what they're trying to do here. They're using sort of pagan magic to get rid of this curse from Yahweh. At the same time, pay back Yahweh with this gold. Now, the interesting thing about this is in Mississippi, I had just read this passage in Mississippi on my bed reading, and I came out to the fellowship area where Marley was one of our site supervisors, and he's a man of faith. He knows the Bible very well. I don't remember what we were talking about, but somehow hemorrhoids came up. And he said, well, there's hemorrhoids in the Bible, which I thought was really weird thing to say. And I said that, and I'm a pastor. I read the Bible pretty regularly. I said, Marley, I don't think there's any hemorrhoids in the Bible. He said, no, there is. There's hemorrhoids in the Bible. I said, Marley, there's just not. He says, oh, no, or no, you looked it up on your phone. And so Cheryl looks it up because we have the phone, so we can find out very quickly. And she's like, oh, yes, it's in 1 Samuel chapter 6. I said, I just read that. I would have remembered the word hemorrhoids. And as it turns out, in the King James, this word tumors, this Hebrew word, can also be translated hemorrhoid. It's just anything that swells up in the body, and it sometimes is translated hemorrhoids. And so if you read the King James Bible, it says 5 gold hemorrhoids were sent back to the Israelites. You can't make this up. And I don't know what God was trying to say to me, because it was so weird that he just mentioned that, and I had literally just read that passage 20 minutes before, and I don't know what that means, but it was very odd to me, the whole experience. So anyway, if anybody ever tells you there are hemorrhoids in the Bible, they're actually right, believe it or not. So moving on, as we will from that. So they send these back to Israel, and they hitch up. I'm in verse 10 now. I'm moving quickly. They put the ark in this cart. They hitch it up to these cows, and they send it on the road. And it goes back, the cows go back to Beth Shemesh, which you see in the lower part of the map here. That's the kind of where they kept putting the ark in a different Philistine city because it kept causing death. And finally, they take it to Ekron, which is close to the border, and they send it with these cows across the border to Beth Shemesh, which is an Israelite city. And of course, the people there are thrilled to have the ark back. But there's this passage here. God struck down some of the inhabitants of Beth Shemesh, putting 70 of them to death because they looked into the ark of the Lord. They opened it up and looked inside. It doesn't say why. Maybe with the thought of stealing something, maybe just not being respectful enough of God's presence, of God's ark. And the people of Beth Shemesh asked, who can stand in the presence of the Lord, this holy God? Finally, somebody asks the right question. How can we stand before a holy God? Eventually, we get it as human beings. It might take us a while. And so they call the people of Kiriath Jearim, which I think is also hilarious in my mind. So right up say, who can stand in the presence of the Lord, this holy God? To whom will the ark go up from here? And then the people of Beth Shemesh, verse 21, send messengers to the people of Kiriath Jearim, another Israelite city, saying, they don't say anything about the people who just died or anything. They say, the Philistines have returned the ark of the Lord. Come and take it. Come down and take it. I think that's funny. So the men of Kiriath Jearim, being naive, come down and they take the ark of the Lord. But something probably happens to them as well, or they find out when they go up to Beth Shemesh the story of what's happening with this ark, that it's so, well, frankly, deadly. So the men of Kiriath Jearim came and take the ark, and they don't bring it into the city. They brought it to Abinadab's house. It said Abinadab's house on the hill, chapter 7, verse 1 now, and consecrated Eleazar, his son, to guard the ark of the Lord. So they take it presumably somewhere kind of outside the city, on a hill, in a house, and they take one man and say, don't let anybody come near this. We're done. And they leave the ark there. Now, of course, where should the ark be? In the sanctuary, in the tabernacle. That's where it belongs. They don't take it back there. They take it to this outskirts of the city. They leave it there. And this is a symbol of how they're feeling about God. He's untrustworthy. God can't be trusted. It's like the old C.S. Lewis adage, he's not a tame lion. And that's where they leave God. It's just, following God is just too, it's spontaneous, it's not organized. I'm starting to describe my church. It's hard to know what's going on from one day to the next with the Lord, and they're just kind of worn out by it. And so, when you come to chapter 8, and I'm skipping some here just for the sake of time, and when they ask for a king, what they're trying to do is they're trying to make sense out of, I want us to have some sympathy for the Israelites. They're surrounded by peoples who are antagonistic and militant towards them, who all have these powerful kings. And these powerful kings create standing armies that, on the face of it, really can wipe up the floor with Israel anytime they want. They have these judges that may or may not be called by God at any time, and it's you have to trust. You have to trust that God is going to do it and that God's going to take care of it. And that's a very hard thing to do, even in my life, when it's not the lives of my family that's on the line here. You know, the stakes are much higher for them than it is for me, and it's hard for me to do it, to really fully trust God that way. So I have sympathy. Who can stand before God, before a holy God? I don't know. Well, we do know, but I get ahead of myself. So, Israel asks for a king. That's here in chapter 8, and I'll read this to you, and we'll get into Saul. Yes, we will. When Samuel grew old, he appointed his sons as Israel's leaders. Now, I want to stop right there real quick. I don't think Samuel actually passes away until like chapter 23 or something like that. Samuel has lots left to do in his life. So I don't know if there's some of you who are feeling, I'm not going to name names, but if you're feeling like you're in the twilight years, I'm not going to name Jerry's name. Certainly not Jerry. It's a small church. But in all seriousness, though, you know, God doesn't retire Samuel. You know, he still has a lot of work left to do on the building in Israel. There's no attention to age in this regard. But at any rate, Samuel grew old, as we are all prone to do if we're blessed enough to get there. And he appointed his sons as Israel's leaders. The name of his firstborn was Joel, the name of his second was Abijah, and they served at Beersheba. But his sons did not follow his ways. They turned aside. This is, of course, a story as old as the hills, too. They turned aside after dishonest gain and accepted bribes and perverted justice. Does that remind you of anybody else's sons? Eli's sons, yeah. Patterns repeat themselves all through history, in our lives, and in the Old Testament, too. Just like Eli's sons, his son. In fact, there's even sort of a geographic sense that says that they lived in Beersheba, which is, well, it doesn't even show here. Well, oh, there it is, yeah. So Beersheba is way down south. It's right on the edge of the desert, the Negev here, desert. There's Beersheba. It's, in fact, a common way of saying all Israel back then was from Dan to Beersheba, which would be like from the far north to the far south. And so there's a sense of his sons even going as far away on the outskirts of Israel as they can. And there's some question here whether or not even Samuel knew that his sons had turned away from the Lord. You know, back then, I mean, before cell phones and email and whatnot, if your sons moved away, you know, you don't have that kind of contact. He may not have even known what his sons were doing. Maybe he did. It's not clear in the text. Anyway, verse 4. All the elders of Israel gathered together. Remember, the ark is just out in the boonies somewhere. Came to Samuel at Ramah, which is Samuel's hometown, where Hannah was and all that. And they said to him, "You're old." It's two words in the Hebrew. You're old. "And your sons don't follow your ways. Appoint a king to lead us." And here's the key verse, "such as all the other nations have." Appoint a king to lead us, such as everybody else has. But when they said, "Give us a king to lead us," this displeased Samuel, and so he prayed to the Lord as judges did, as they were filled with the Spirit. He was upset, and so he prayed. And the Lord said to him, "Listen to what the people are saying to you. It's not you they've rejected. This isn't about you. It's not even about your sons, Samuel. They've rejected me as their king," because that ark is still there in the boonies, and they're not even interested. "As they have done from the day I brought them up out of Egypt, forsaking me, serving other gods, they're doing the exact same thing to you." So God says, listen to them, but warn them solemnly and let them know what the king who will reign over them will claim as his rights. Now remember, the judges didn't claim rights like kings did. If they raised an army, they did it in the spirit, but they didn't have this kind of power over people that a king would. Samuel told all the words of the Lord to the people who were asking him for a king. So he reports this to the people. He said, "This is what the king who will reign over you will claim as his rights. He'll take your sons and make them serve with his chariots and horses, and they will run in front of his chariots." So they'll be the ground troops, the shock troops, if you will. "Some he will assign to be commanders of thousands and commanders of 50s, others to plow his ground," that's a key word there, "others to plow his ground, the king's ground, and reap his harvest, and others to make weapons of war and equipment for his chariots. He'll take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He'll take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive groves and give them to his attendants. He'll take a tenth of your grain, of your vintage." You know, I won't read the whole thing. You get the point. They're establishing a government. This is welcome to taxes. And we know this. You know, a lot of what's going on here in 1 Samuel is how shall we rule ourselves? How shall we? Lord knows this is, every generation struggles with this. Every generation tries to find the best way to rule ourselves. And we know there's always a give and take with giving up a certain amount of freedom so that anarchy is kept at bay. Give up a certain amount of freedom so we have a certain amount of control. And the tension, you know, it runs throughout our country and throughout indeed our souls. And they're dealing with the exact same tension. And what they're saying now is we want to give up some freedom. We want to give up some. We would like a king and that solidity, because Lord, you're just too, you're not predictable, and it fills us with fear. And they do away with the theocracy, and they go forward. So on and so forth, and now gets to the fun part. At least I think it's the fun part. So God, sometimes in the Bible, God actually is. And I won't go into the various stories, but God is capable of genuinely, honestly being sarcastic and humorous. It's a thing. I don't mean to belittle. I don't think God has a sense of humor like humans do. Part of what makes things humorous for us is the sense of surprise. That's what makes something funny, and you can't surprise. God doesn't have a sense of humor like we do, but he knows we do. And I think he puts these things in here for our consideration and sometimes for our pleasure. You know, in the same way, you know, I don't particularly enjoy throwing sticks, but my dog likes it. So I'll throw sticks for my dog, and my dog thinks I'm having a great time throwing sticks, but I'm not. But I like that he's having a great time getting the sticks, you know, such as this. So we wanted a king. Us humans, if I can put us back in this text, we wanted a king, and we got one. So now comes the story of the lost donkeys, because I think this is pretty funny. I'm just going to read it. So there was a Benjaminite, a man of standing, whose name was Kish, son of Abiel, son of Zeror, son of Bechorath, son of Aphi of Benjamin. So the Benjaminites lived in, they were the smallest of the tribes. you probably can't see him, but there's a little blue circle right in the middle of Israel, in between Judah and Ephraim. That's the tribe of Benjamin. Kish had a son named Saul, as handsome a young man as could be found anywhere in Israel. This dude was good looking. Must be nice for him. And he was a head taller than anyone else. Already we don't like this guy. But he looks like a king, right? That's what you want a king to look like. No one's banging on my door to be king. But now it gets weird. Now the donkeys. Now people just asked for a king, and Samuel's upset about this, and now we're talking about donkeys. Now the donkeys belonging to Saul's father Kish were lost, and Kish said to his son Saul, "Take one of the servants with you and go and look for the donkeys." So he passed through the hill country of Ephraim, which, as we saw right there, was just right next door, through the area around Shalisha, but they did not find them. They went on into the district of Shalim, but the donkeys were not there. He passed through the territory of Benjamin, again, presumably, but they did not find them. When they reached the district of Zuph, Saul said to the servant who was with him, "Okay," he says, "let's go back. We're not finding these donkeys. And my dad's going to start worrying about us if we don't come back soon." But the servant replied, "Look, in this town there's a man of God. He's highly respected. Everything he says comes true." He's talking about Samuel, of course. "Let's go there now. Perhaps he will tell us what way to take to look for the donkeys." And Saul said to his servant, "If we go, what can we give the man? The food in our sacks is gone. We've no gift. What do we have?" And the servant said, "Look, I've got a quarter of a shekel of silver." And at this point, you're reading the story like, really? This is how we're selecting a king now? Anyway, it says, "I have a quarter of a shekel of silver. I'll give it to the man of God so that he will tell us what way to take." And then there's a little parenthetical, which we'll skip. "Good," Saul said to his servant. "Come, let's go." So they set out for the town where the man of God was. As they were going up the hill to the town, they met some young women coming out to draw water, and they asked them, "Is the seer here?" Another word for a prophet at that time. "He is," they answered. "He's ahead of you. Hurry now. He's just come to our town today, for the people have a sacrifice at the high place." Samuel would do a circuit through Israel, sort of like the itinerant Methodist preachers. He would go around and preach and do sacrifices. As soon as you enter the town, you'll find him before he goes up to the high place to eat. The people will not begin eating until he comes, Samuel, because he must bless the sacrifice, and afterward those who are invited will eat. So go now, you should find him about this time. So here they go, still looking for the donkeys. They went up to the town, and as they were entering it, there was Samuel coming toward them on his way up to the high place. Now, the day before Saul came, the Lord had revealed to Samuel, "At about this time tomorrow, I'll send you a man from the land of Benjamin." So this is all under God's divine control. And then, just out of the blue, "Anoint him ruler over my people Israel." Okay? "He'll deliver them from the hand of the Philistines. I have looked on my people, and their cry has reached me." And we find out later that about the military situation, but we won't go into that right now. So Samuel caught sight of Saul, and we know what Saul looks like. And the Lord said to him, "This is the man I spoke to you about. He will govern my people." Saul approached Samuel in the gateway and asked, would you please tell me where the seer's house is?" And Samuel says, "It's me. So go up ahead of me to the high place, for today you are to eat with me." So he's elevating Saul, sort of a sit at my right hand kind of situation. "And in the morning I will send you on your way and tell you all that is in your heart." And it's interesting, Samuel totally misreads this. Samuel thinks that Saul wants to be king, and that probably God has already spoken to Saul about this in some regard. And so there's this miscommunication. As we find out, Saul is not thrilled about this. And he says, "And to whom is all the desire of Israel turned, if not to you and your whole family line?" So Samuel says, look at you, and marvelous king. And Saul's like, "I want my donkeys." At least that's what I'm thinking is going through Saul's head. But Samuel is clearly, smitten with this king-like individual. And Saul says, "But I'm a Benjamite from the smallest tribe of Israel. My clan's the least of all the clans. Why would you say such a thing to me? Why would you make me king?" He's shocked. Then Samuel brought Saul and the servant into the hall and seated them at the head of all those who were invited. And then they eat, and the cook takes the best meat and puts it in front of Saul. And Samuel says, "This has been kept for you, And verse 25, after they came down from the high place to the town, Samuel talked with Saul on the roof of his house, and they rose about daybreak, and Samuel called to Saul on the roof, "Get ready, and I will send you on your way." When Saul got ready, he and Samuel went outside together. As they were going down to the edge of town, Samuel said to Saul, "Tell the servant to go on ahead of us, and you stay here for a while so I can give you a message." And this is where the anointing takes place. Samuel takes a flask of olive oil, anoints him as king, and says, "Has not the Lord anointed you ruler over his inheritance?" Now keep in mind, no one else knows about this now. This is just between Samuel and Saul and the Lord. And, okay, I'm skipping over a little bit here. Oh, here we go. Well, actually, let's go, verse 2. When you leave me today, you'll meet two men near Rachel's tomb at Zelzah on the border of Benjamin. And they'll say to you, "The donkeys you set out to look for have been found." So that takes care of the donkeys. Your father has stopped thinking about them and is now worried about you. And he's asking, "What shall I do about my son?" So all this is all under God's divine control. And later on, in chapter 10, they actually draw lots to see who will be king. And God arranges it so that Saul is the one who the lots fall to. And there's a humorous passage here in verse 20. Samuel had all Israel come forward by tribes. The tribe of Benjamin was taken by lot. Verse 21. Then he brought forward the tribe of Benjamin, clan by clan, and Matri's clan was taken. And finally they get down to Saul, son of Kish. The lots fall to him. But when they looked for him, he was not to be found. Where was he? He was hiding. They inquired further of the Lord, "Has the man come here yet?" And the Lord said, presumably through Samuel, "Yes, he's hidden himself among the supplies." So Saul, literally knowing the lot is going to fall to him and freaked out by all this, has hidden himself among the supplies, and they have to go and find him and bring him out and make him king. Long live the king. No, I'm reading it. That's in verse 24. And they're not excited about this at all once they realize that Saul doesn't want to be king. In fact, it says here in verse 27, some scoundrel said, "How can this fellow save us?" So there's a split. And some people say, okay, he can be king. Some people are like, well, he doesn't really want to be king. And the energy goes out, and it kind of goes away. And nothing really happens until battle. And then the Holy Spirit comes down on Saul, like he did with the judges, and Saul defeats the Philistines, and then they start to get excited about him as king. But Saul still is not excited about being king. So it's a long, and frankly, it's kind of a silly story, but I encourage you to read it in its full on your own with the thought of what God is trying to tell us about this. The narratives of how people became king in the Near East, in whatever nation you might pick, tended to be long, elaborate, and very dramatic and powerful. You know, a god would come down, and sort of King Arthur, right? Like a sword in the stone type stuff, or a god or goddess would come and anoint and I mean, it was a very there were a lot of dramatic stories regarding how somebody would become king, whether it's Sargon of Akkad or Tiglath-Pileser or all these guys. And this is a foolish story about a man who went out to find his donkeys. And throughout this whole passage, if I'd read the whole thing, you see Saul continues to be worried about his donkeys up until the very end. He's not really cotton on to this whole thing of being king. It's a weird and kind of silly way to become king. And God is using sarcasm to be like, okay, you want a king? I'll give you someone who looks like a king, but has no desire to be one. And you're going to hand over all your freedom to this foolishness. Not all, but a significant portion of your freedom. Now, none of this, you might say, really relates to my life in any direct fashion. In a way, you'd be right. We live in a very different time and place and country. There's no talk about going back to a theocracy that's led by judges. I'm not starting a political revolution here, you'll be glad to know. And indeed, the notion of recreating a theocracy is not one that we as Christians are to adopt, for we're waiting for Christ's return. But there is something true here, and I think Loki said it best, so I'm going to... I don't know how many of you have seen the Avengers, the first Avengers. Great movie, I like it. There's a scene where Loki, who's the bad guy in the first Avengers, makes all the people kneel before him. And he says this, He says, kneel before me. I said, kneel. Is not this simpler? Is this not your natural state? It's the unspoken truth of humanity that you crave subjugation. The bright lure of freedom diminishes your life's joy in a mad scramble for power, for identity. You were made to be ruled, and in the end, you will always kneel. I remember when I first saw that in the movie theater, it's a very well shot scene. I thought, he's kind of got a point. I mean, we really were built to worship, and we were built to kneel, but not before each other, and certainly not before Loki, although I'm a big fan of that actor. But I was kind of like, yeah, I was never happier. I was never more blessed than on the day I first kneeled. I never kneeled to anybody or anything till I kneeled to God. And that was such a load off of my shoulders. And it is a hard thing to follow the Lord. Everybody's life, everybody's walk with God should be a personal theocracy. It is difficult. You can't control it. And when we get to trying to control it, we get to messing it up pretty bad, and we give away freedoms that God would have you have. God would have you have those freedoms. And that's not a small thing. And the things that the Israelites are struggling with in this passage are things that I can relate to deeply. And God's sense of sarcasm about the leaders I've given my life to in idolatrous type ways is still present and powerful. When I can feel a blush coming up in me when I think about the things I've worshipped in the past, and the foolishness of those things, and the idiocy of those things. Perhaps the most foolish being myself, thinking that I can handle it all. But there's a kind of whack-a-mole that we play as human beings when it comes to our freedom and how we will rule ourselves as individuals and as a government. You whack one thing down and another thing pops right up. In the meta-narrative of things, in the way we rule ourselves, whether it be capitalism or communism, democracy or socialism or all these things, obviously I have my preferences. I would share them with you, but this is not the place for that. You have your preferences too. But I hope you all can see it is a game of whack-a-mole, that you knock down one thing and something else comes up. You don't want to enslave your fellow human beings. You don't want to give them too much freedom. You know what the heck to do with them? It's like they're full of sin. They can barely be controlled. And so it is. And I have that image in my head now, and I think I'll hold on to it for some months probably, of the ark languishing on some hilltop somewhere in some boondock city that we can't even find archaeologically anymore, and one solitary man guarding it, and no one paying any attention. And that's all they needed, was the presence of the Lord to defeat the Philistines and to be secure. And they said, no thank you, we'd like a king. I can relate to that. One last anecdote, I suppose, and then we'll get to worship here. I love going down to Mississippi. I love the things that happen down there, the Habitat for Humanity. The poverty is always overwhelming. The poverty is deep. I mean, it really is like a third world country down there. If you get the opportunity to go down there and see some of the houses these folks live in, they're unbelievable. One of the things that my son Juddy noticed when we were driving around Clarksdale, and he said, there sure are a lot of churches. And it's true, you can't throw a rock without hitting a church. Some of those churches have had a lot of rocks thrown at them. A lot of broken windows and walls and things. And I said, yeah, a lot of churches down here. And he said, why is that? And I thought about that for a while. I took my time with that one. I was like, why are there so many churches down there? And I said, you know what it is? He said, there's a lot of suffering down here and a lot of poverty, and people want hope. And God symbolizes hope for people. And that's true. And that's the positive part. But there's a dark underbelly to that too. One of the things I don't like to tell people, and I don't like it when my coworkers tell people, when we're on the work site or we're visiting someplace, is for people to tell people I'm a pastor. In Clarksdale, Mississippi, when people find out I'm a pastor, they treat me very differently, with all kinds of stuff, dignity, acclaim, deference, these kinds of things. And it makes me very nervous. I don't like it. And I think a lot of what goes on there is there's a lot of Sauls down there too. People who are a head taller and charismatic and good speakers, better speakers than me, who take advantage of people who are looking for hope And I've heard that story down there, half a dozen times or more of pastors who have taken advantage because they knew that people were looking for hope and they became Sauls. And so it doesn't matter, my point in all that, the church is also not the place of, it really is the Holy Spirit. The church is not the place of authority. The pastor is not the seat of authority. And I don't want to be the seat of authority. I want to be God. And I want the chaos that comes with that. Not complete chaos. I mean, there's still a place of worship. We talked about Eli and the complete chaos of his temple, and there are ways to do things, proper and appropriate. But the chaos in the sense that I don't know what God's going to do tomorrow, that I want. I want to hold on to that. You pray with me.